We're going to get started. I'm Paul Siciliano, professor in the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture and director of the Purdue Arboretum. I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight on behalf of our landscape architecture program and also on behalf of our lecture series sponsors, the Bookwalter family. The goal of this discussion tonight is to inspire us to create beautiful and environmentally friendly landscapes, both professionally and also in our home gardens. The lecture will be recorded, so I would ask you to please check your cell phones at this point and make sure that the sound is turned off or that the phone itself is turned off, okay? And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Doug Tallamy is known for his groundbreaking work on the interrelationship between native plants and native wildlife, highlighting the need for all of us to consider how we can bring nature home to our own gardens. He is a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 92 research publications and has taught insect taxonomy, behavioral ecology, humans and nature, insect ecology, and other courses for 37 years. His book, Bringing Nature Home, How Native Plants Sustain Wildlife in Our Gardens, was published by Timber Press in 2007 and was awarded the 2008 Silver Medal by the Garden Writers Association. His second book, The Living Landscape, co-authored with Rick Dark, was published in 2014. Doug is also a regular columnist for Garden Design magazine. He is a lifetime honorary director of Wild Ones and has won the Garden Club of America Margaret Douglas Medal for Conservation, the Tom Dodd Jr. Award of Excellence, and the 2018 AHS B.Y. Morrison Communication Award. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Doug Tallamy.
Thank you, Paul. Everybody can hear me? This is a new experience for me. I don't think I've ever given a talk at 5 o'clock, even though I've given lots of talks, and I've never given one in triplicate. Well, we have a lot to talk about. So thank you for coming at 5 o'clock. I mean, you guys either eat early or you eat real late. I want to talk about restoring nature's relationships, but the real message here is that we humans have to develop a new relationship with the natural world, because the one we have right now is not sustainable, and we need it to be sustainable or we're going to disappear. So it's a pretty important topic. And in order to do that, we have to understand what the natural world is. What is nature? We are part of it, but nature, by and large, is a series of very specialized relationships. So let's talk about some of these relationships. This is one of them. This is the resplendent quetzal. It's an endangered species in the forests of Central America, and it's endangered for one primary reason: it has a very specialized diet. If you don't have fruits of the wild avocado tree, you don't have that beautiful bird. And we have cut down most of the wild avocado trees. But we want that bird in our future, so we figured out we can actually put those trees back. That's an avocado tree right there, and those folks are planting it. Fortunately, those trees grow pretty quickly. They reach the age at which they produce those fruits in not too many years. And it's actually starting to look better for that future of that beautiful bird. That same conservation scenario is repeated time and again, though. If you want to save jaguars, you have to have particular species of palm trees. Why palm trees? Because they make palm nuts, and palm nuts happen to be the favorite food of peccaries, which is the favorite food of jaguars. So we're talking about specialization in the natural world, particularly specialization focused on food webs as being the rule, not the exception, and it always starts with plants. Now, a lot of people think you get all that specialization in the tropical areas of the world because there's a lot of it down there. But we actually have a lot of specialization up here in the temperate zone as well, and some of the most specialized relationships that have ever evolved anywhere occur right in our yards. This is one of them. This is a bolus spider. It's a female hanging from a river birch leaf in my yard. And it's obvious why she's called a bolus spider. She doesn't spin a web. She just drops a single strand of silk, puts one sticky glob of glue at the end there. Now, she doesn't swing it around her head like a bolus. But she does. It looks like she goes fishing with it. She drops it, raises it, lowers it real slowly. And the first time I saw her do that, I told her, "You're not going to catch anything." because I couldn't believe something would fly into that little target by accident. I thought a web would be a much better design. And that's the way I used to fish, and I didn't catch anything. But about 15 seconds later, a moth flew in, got stuck in her sticky glob of glue. She reeled it in and manipulated it for some time and actually created an egg mass out of that moth. What I didn't know at the time is that that was not an accident. She was releasing the sex pheromone of that particular species of moth. So that guy's a male. He thought she was a female. She was, but the wrong species. And it turns out that every species of bola spider in the world mimics a sex pheromone of one species of moth. So you can have bola spiders in your yard if you have the plant that supports the larval development of the moth that your bola spider is mimicking the sex pheromone of. Again, specialized relationship that gets back to plants. Phlox divaricator, very common spring ephemeral in our gardens, spreads readily from seed, but only if it's pollinated. And if you look at the entrance to that corolla there, it's extremely narrow, tiny little hole. Watch native bees land on these flowers and try to get their mouth parts in there, and they can't do it. So who's pollinating our phlox? Well, it turns out it's day-flying sphinx moths. Things like this hummingbird sphinx or this snowberry clearwing. They have a very long tongue. They sink it deep into the corolla of those flowers, and when they pull it out, it is covered with pollen. And then they fly to the next flower and pollinate it. So you can get your phlox pollinated if you have adult snowberry clearwings. You can have adult snowberry clearwings if you have larval snowberry clearwings. And you can have larval snowberry clearwings if you have their host plant, coral honeysuckle, the native honeysuckle. Even animals we don't think of as having specialized relationships with plants often do, at least at one part of their life history. And I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. Now you have, it's probably black-capped chickadee here. A little farther south is Carolina chickadee. They're almost identical. They're doing the same thing. We think of chickadees as seed eaters because this is where we encounter them most of the time. They are at our feeders all the time eating particularly those sunflower seeds. I used to think that was all their diet in the wintertime, but it's actually only 50% of their diet. They're eating insects the rest of the time. But when they are reproducing, when they are making more chickadees, a very important time in their life history, their babies can't eat seeds. They cannot feed them seeds, so they switch to insects. And if they are in a healthy environment, they will feed their babies almost exclusively on caterpillars. And it turns out that they are not exceptions. Most of the birds in North America are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. So let's ask the question, why caterpillars? There are a lot of insects out there, but what is special about caterpillars? Well, there are a number of hypotheses, and one is that most of these caterpillars are soft. They're relatively soft, and that means you can stuff them down the throat of your baby without fear of injuring it. And if you've ever watched a parent bird feed its young, they're pretty rough. They use their beak as a plunger, and they really do just stuff it down there. They're also relatively large prey items. So one medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of about 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller warblers do chase aphids around, but you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar. They are nutritious. They're very high in protein. They're very high in fats. They have a low percentage of chitin, of exoskeleton, compared to the amount of food that is in that caterpillar. So think of them as a sausage with a very thin wrapper, compared to a beetle, which is like a tank. Its exoskeleton is very thick, and and remember, chitin is undigestible, so you don't want to be eating tanks built with chitin. And it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds when they are breeding, when they're making babies. I mention carotenoids because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Yet we vertebrates don't make carotenoids. We have to get them from plants. And that's why my wife Cindy tells me I have to eat my carrots to get my beta-carotene, and I have to eat my tomatoes to get my lycopene, my whatever that is to get my lutein. And she makes sure I eat all that stuff because they stimulate my immune system. I am generally healthier when I have access to lots of carotenoids. They're antioxidants, and they run around our bodies and protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They do improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality. Who doesn't need that? Improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about largely male birds, like this prothonotary warbler. They take the carotenoids and they build pigments out of them and then put them in their feathers. So this guy is bright yellow because he's had access to lots of luteins. And the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. All right, back to chickadees. They are vertebrates. They are not making their own carotenoids, so they have to get them from plants. But they're not eating plants when they're reproducing, so they have to get them from something that did eat plants. And yes, that something is insects. But here's the key. Caterpillars have twice as many carotenoids as other types of insects and 3 times as many as spiders. And spiders are important components of bird food webs as well as caterpillars. So it's looking like that for birds, caterpillars are not optional parts of the diet. They are essential parts of the diet of a breeding bird. And that means if you're trying to reproduce in an area that does not have enough caterpillars, you're going to fail. Having almost enough caterpillars isn't good enough. You got to have enough to bring those babies through to independence. So that's the next question. How many caterpillars does it take to make a clutch of chickadees? And the answer is it takes a lot. And it was these birds that taught me that. I put a little chickadee box up in my yard. The idea way back then was to find out what they were feeding their young. So I hung this box low so I could set my camera up and take pictures of what they were bringing back to the nest every time they came in. And that's when I learned they were bringing back caterpillars, but I also learned they were bringing them back very quickly. Both the male and the female chickadee are out foraging most of the day, and that means they can bring a caterpillar back to the nest once every 3 minutes. I watched it for 27 minutes at one point, and during that 27 minutes, they brought back 30 caterpillars. How do they do that? By bringing back more than one at a time, sometimes a whole bunch. And they're doing this all day long. They're working very hard, about 6 a.m. all the way to 8 p.m. Okay, the next question is, how many species of caterpillars are they bringing back? And this is an important question. First of all, chickadees and most birds do not forage very far from the nest. They don't want to spend more energy looking for food for the babies than they get from the food itself. And it's a they're very industrious. They spend a lot of energy foraging, so they've got to do it close to the nest. With chickadees, it's about 50 meters from the nest. Well, I watched them for 3 hours. And during that 3 hours, they brought back 17 species of caterpillars that they collected from within 50 meters of the nest. Remember, the nest is in my yard, so they're getting those caterpillars right in my yard. Well, this is important because if I had 1 or 2 species of caterpillars in my yard, and it happened to be a bad year for those species where there weren't that many caterpillars, the chickadees would not be able to successfully reproduce. But if I have 17 species, or 34 species, or 134 species, and 2 years ago I decided I was going to count the moth species in my yard, not the butterflies, just the moth, I am up to 879 species of caterpillars in my yard. There will always be some combination of all those species, that in combination, regardless of the weather, regardless of the population fluctuations, there will be enough caterpillars so the chickadees get to breed every year. And that's important. They don't live that long. They can't skip a year and hope that next year is better. They want to breed every single year. So this is an example of diversity creating stability in the food web, or diversity creating stability in the ecosystem. You've heard that diversity is good. This is why. Okay, a guy by the name of Richard Brewer, way back in 1961, was studying Carolina chickadees, and one of the things he wanted to know was how many caterpillars did they bring back to the nest. So he watched a whole bunch of chickadee nests, and he found out it was between 390 and 570 caterpillars per day, depending on the number of chicks in the nest. And they're in the nest for 16 days before they fledge. Now, after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 24 days before they're actually independent. But Brewer only counted up till the point they fledge, because after they fledge, they're flying all around, and he didn't know where they were. That's 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars just to the point where they're fledging, that they're collecting from within 50 meters of the nest. That's the number of caterpillars you need in your yard if you want 1 pair of breeding chickadees. And they're tiny birds, 1/3 of an ounce. What if I wanted a red-bellied woodpecker in my yard? It's 8 times heavier than a chickadee. How many caterpillars does that take? And I don't want just chickadees and red-bellied woodpeckers. I want a whole community of what used to be common birds in our yards. I want scarlet tanagers, I want titmice and blue jays and bluebirds and tree swallows and common yellowthroats and indigo bunnings and towhees and yellow warblers and wood thrushes and wrens and cardinals and hummingbirds. And I don't want 1 pair of them. I want breeding populations of these guys, at least in my neighborhood. How many caterpillars does that take? It takes a lot. It takes a lot of caterpillars. You might say, well, we don't need any insects for Mr. Hummingbird because he eats sugar water. That's what he's doing right there. Actually, that's Mrs. Hummingbird. They do eat sugar water after they have had 80 to 90% of their diet being insects and spiders. Then they go get the sugar water. And that is true for 96% of the terrestrial birds in North America. They are rearing their young directly or indirectly on insect protein. This is a list of the families that do that. And this is news. This is news to a lot of people. Most people think birds eat seed or berries because that's what we put out in the wintertime. And the birds that don't migrate do eat seeds and berries because that's pretty much what's there in the wintertime. The birds that do migrate, by the way, are all insectivores. That's why they're migrating, because their food is further south. But even the birds that stick around are eating insects most of the year. So we have a lot of books talking landscaping for birds, and they will tell you how to put plants in your yard that make seeds and berries, and that's great. But we also need plants in the yard that make the insects that create the birds that then go eat the seeds and berries. Without the insects, you're not going to have the birds. So, no insects, no baby birds. A bit of an exaggeration, but not much, not much. Okay, what types of landscapes are we talking about here? What types of landscapes are capable of producing the abundance and diversity of insects that are required to have these breeding birds or other life forms in your yard? Well, to answer that question, we have to now consider the most common type of specialized relationship that occurs all over the planet. And that's the relationship between the insects that eat plants and the plants themselves. So we're not talking about pollinators right now. We're talking about things like this polyphemus moth caterpillar and the oak leaf that it's eating. Remember, plants really don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they have loaded their leaves, loaded their tissues with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And next spring, when you got a bunch of green leaves out there, if you don't believe me, go out and eat one. See if you like it. You're not going to like it. All plants are protecting themselves chemically, and they don't taste good. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green in the summertime. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat those plants. They are too well protected chemically. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are what we call host plant specialists. They pick one or two plant lineages that share a common cocktail of chemical defenses, and they develop the adaptations necessary to circumvent those defenses, to get around them. They develop the enzymes, the physiological mechanisms that allow them to detoxify those compounds, store and excrete them. They develop the behavioral adaptations, the life history adaptations that allow them to avoid contact with those compounds as much as possible. But all those adaptations take a long period of evolutionary exposure to those particular plant lineages. They don't fall into place overnight. And I'm going to use the monarch butterfly as an example because you already know half the story of the monarch. You already know that the monarch is a specialist on milkweed. And you probably already know that milkweed protects its tissues with nasty compounds called cardiac glycosides. So when you're out eating plants next year, don't eat milkweeds because cardiac glycosides stop your heart. That's the defensive action. Now, they don't stop the heart of the monarch, and they do have a heart, by the way, because the monarchs have those physiological adaptations. They can eat cardiac glycosides without dying. That's good. But what about the sticky latex sap that gives milkweeds its common name? You know, when you break open a milkweed vein, you get all this white goo that comes out. If it gets on your finger, you typically wipe it off right away. But if you don't, let it sit there for a minute or so, it starts to gel. Turns into a chewing gum-like substance. And what does that do? That if you're a caterpillar and you get that all over your mouth parts, it glues them shut. It gums them up and then glues them shut, and then you starve to death. So, how does the monarch caterpillar, which we know eats milkweed leaves, how does it do that without getting its mouth parts glued shut? Well, this is a behavioral adaptation that allows it to eat milkweeds, and most other insects haven't figured this out yet. And you can watch this at home, plant some milkweeds, the monarchs will come, the caterpillar will crawl onto your leaf. Typically it goes to the end of the milkweed leaf and it starts to chew, and if any latex sap starts to come out, it'll stop eating right away, turn around, crawl back up the leaf, maybe 2/3 of the way, and it starts to chew through the midrib. And it chews until it has completely severed the midrib. And what it's doing is blocking the canals that shunt the latex sap from this end of the leaf to this end of the leaf. So now this end of the leaf has no sticky stuff in it. They turn around, they go back down, and they can eat the leaf without any latex sap coming out at all. So it's a very simple reaction to milky sap, but again, most other insects have not figured out how to do that. That flags the leaf. If you're a monarch hunter for some reason, you can drive down the road and look at milkweed patches. If you see flag leaves like that, you know it's got monarch caterpillars. Okay, those are the upsides of specialization. By focusing on this one genus of plants, Asclepias, monarchs are now able to beat the milkweeds at their own game. They can get around the cardiac glycosides, and they've figured out how to block the milky latex sap. All because they specialize on it. The downside of specialization is that now that's all they can eat. So by specializing on milkweeds, they haven't spent any time developing the adaptations necessary to get around the tannins that are in oak leaves, or the cucurbitaceans in cucurbits, or the nicotine in tobacco, or the cyanide in cherry. All plants have something out there, and monarchs can't eat any of them unless it's a milkweed. And that, of course, means if we take the milkweeds out of the landscape, which we have pretty much done, monarchs have nothing to eat. So they disappear. And that's why 2013, that were the lowest point of the monarch population, about 3.6% left of the migrating population compared to what was here in 1976. And that's because we've been treating our landscapes as if there were endless other landscapes out there to make up the difference. We've invented Roundup Ready corn and soybeans. We now spray right up to the road. We replaced the weeds that are actually good native plants with grass, and the monarch has no more milkweeds. We've never shared our residential neighborhoods very well with milkweeds. And part of the problem is we've got a marketing issue. We call them weeds. If we called milkweed Monarch's Delight, everybody would be planting it. It'd be great. We call these plants weeds. When the Europeans came over, they started, they didn't adopt the agricultural methods of the Native Americans. They planted monocultures. And any plant that came up in the middle of those monocultures, they called a weed. And that's how many of our native plants got their names. It doesn't mean they're bad plants. I don't want you to think that it's just butterflies, just moths that are specialists. This is the elderberry beetle. Only eats elderberry. The dogbane beetle only eats dogbane. Sumac flea beetle only eats sumac. This is a Koread bug, leaf-footed bug that only eats ash. So if the emerald ash borer comes, kills all our ashes, this guy will disappear. Dave Wagner, University of Connecticut, has looked at the ash specialists, 95 species of ash specialists. They'll all disappear if we lose our ashes. And that's the problem, the fact that so many of our insects out there are host plant specialists. If you take away the plant in which they specialized, we will lose those insects. And we'll talk about why we can't afford to lose those insects in a minute. There is some good news here, and that is as we learn more and more about what different food webs are comprised of, we can actually rebuild those food webs wherever we want. So if we're talking about bringing nature home or putting functioning ecosystems back into human-dominated landscapes, we got to build food webs where we've taken them out. So I'm going to give you an example of how to build a food web for the white-eyed vireo. And I'm going to use that as an example because that's the nest that my wife Cindy found in our yard a few years ago. Now the birds knew that I needed to take pictures of the caterpillars they were bringing back to the nest, or I couldn't reconstruct the food web. So they built the nest very low so I could set my camera up again. If I know what the species of caterpillar is, we know a lot about what caterpillars eat. Then we know the plant that was necessary to make the bird food that is required for this bird to rear its young. So let's look at a few of these. That caterpillar is the blinded sphinx moth. It's a specialist on black cherry. We have a lot of black cherry at our house making blinded sphinx moths so the babies get to eat. This little guy is the chestnut schizura, and despite its common name, it is a specialist on native viburnums. Now at our house, that's Viburnum dentatum, arrowwood. We know that because we planted it. Our yard was mowed for hay before we moved in, so most of the plants that are there now are ones that we have planted ourselves. And it's Our native viburnums are making chestnut chazuras so the babies get to eat again. This guy with the white stripe is the drab prominent, a specialist on sycamores. And we did not plant sycamores in our yard, but this is our 18th summer. So maybe 16 years ago, there was a big wind. It blew in some sycamore seeds from somewhere. One landed in my cold frame, and it germinated. I'm not fast at weeding things out. It's now about 60 feet tall. But it's making drab prominence, so the babies get to eat again. And on we go. This is the 8-spotted forester moth, a specialist on native grapes. We have lots of those. This is the lunate zale, another specialist on black cherry. This is the spicebush swallowtail. That's its phony eye there. It's supposed to fool the bird into thinking it's a tree snake. It didn't work this time. It's a specialist on spicebush and also sassafras, a close relative. We have both of those. This little guy's the tufted bird-dropping moth, another specialist on black cherry. So black cherry is emerging as an important component of this bird's food web. But these guys are hungry. They need a lot more food than that, so let's put some black walnut in the landscape. If we do that, we get the walnut sphinx, the gray-edged bomaloka, the black blotch caesura, the bride, all specialists on black walnut where I come from. We have native maples. We have Plagodes inchworms, the green-striped maple worm, the maple bantam dagger moth, and of course many others. Native elms. That's the American elm. Give us the four-horned sphinx, the double-toothed prominent, the interrupted dagger moth, and again, many others. Remember, 90% of the insects that we need to feed this bird will not be in our yard if we don't have the plants that make those insects. So if we want the mustard sallow, we need witch hazel. If we want the hackberry emperor, we need hackberry. If we want Cuculio asteroides, we need native asters. The Arcidra flower moth, the goldenrod flower moth, the brown-hooded owlet all need goldenrod. The hog sphinx, Pandora sphinx, abbot sphinx all need Virginia creeper. The redbud leaf roller needs redbud. The gray furcula needs native willows. Turbulent phosphilla needs greenbrier. And the orange tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the white blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-line panapoder, and the laugher all need oak. Because oak is the most powerful plant you can put in your yard. And that is true in 84% of the counties in North America. You can't lose with oaks. By the way, you know where I took all those pictures? Somebody say your backyard. Your backyard. Thank you. No, I took it in my front yard. That used to be the common area. I would took it in your backyard. Because we talk about backyard habitat. And I don't like that term because it suggests that everything I'm talking about is so ugly, we have to hide it in the backyard. We don't. You can have an oak in your front yard. It also cuts our conservation area in half. Why is the front yard off limit? I don't know. It's not. It's not off limit. Why do we need all these insects? Well, we talked about birds needing them, and yes, we like our birds. But if you look carefully at different food webs, everywhere, insects are critical components of almost every terrestrial food web that is out there. All spiders, for example, eat insects, or they eat other spiders that ate insects. And I know a lot of people don't like spiders, but look who does. It is the second most important component of bird food webs. If you got rid of the spiders, you'd be clobbering the birds again, but you'd also lose a really valuable predator. Instead of hiring Joe the Mosquito Man to fog your neighborhood and kill everything, just keep your spiders around, and they will start eating your mosquitoes. We would also lose, if we lost our insect herbivores, we would lose our insect predators. There are a lot of predators out there, and they themselves are important components of insect food webs. If we lost our insects, we would lose our frogs, we would lose our toads, we'd lose all the amphibians, because they all eat insects. We'd also lose our lizards, we would also lose our bats and our rodents. A lot of people think rodents eat seed, and of course they do when they can't find enough insects. But the reason these guys are eating insects is they're just really good food. Pound for pound, there's twice as much protein in insect meat as there is in beef, and insects have organs in their abdomen called fat bodies. These are organs that are loaded with lipids, high energy compounds that allow these little guys to grow quickly, reproduce quickly. And if you're a mouse, that's what you want to do because there's a lot of things that want to eat you. But it's the same reason that larger organisms are eating insects. The skunk is digging up your yard to get grubs in your yard. Possums eat a lot of insects. Raccoons eat a lot of insects. Even things we don't think of as insectivores eat a lot of insects. like our friend the red fox, 25% of its diet is insects, a full quarter of its diet. 23% of a black bear's diet is insects. So it doesn't matter how big you are, you need insects. Even if you don't eat insects, you need insects. This is the sharp-shinned hawk. And you might think, well, I can get rid of all the insects in my neighborhood and still have sharp-shinned hawks. But think about it. This guy's a bird predator. If you get rid of all the insects in the neighborhood, you've gotten rid of all the birds. That's his food. So he's not eating insects directly, he's eating them indirectly. Same thing with the garter snake. Adult garter snakes hardly eat any insects at all. They're eating the frogs and the toads that ate the insects. Point is, a world without insects is a world without biological diversity. And E.O. Wilson told us decades ago, the world without biological diversity is a world without humans. And somehow that message has been lost. Either that or we never believed him to begin with, but it is true. We need our insects. You've seen the reports lately, particularly from Europe, about all the insects that are disappearing. Insects run the ecosystems that support us. We humans, Wilson says, we humans won't last more than a few months on planet Earth without insects. We got to put them back, folks. We've got to put them back. What's happening to all those things that directly eat insects? In most cases, we are not measuring what's happening. The World Wildlife Fund has some very general figures, like we now have half the animal life on planet Earth that we had about 40 years ago. But one thing we do measure is birds. We have a lot of birders out there. Something called the State of the Birds Report comes out every year. These are data from 2016. I've been afraid to look at 2017. 432 species of North American birds at risk of extinction. Now that doesn't mean there's only 5 left of each one. We figured out that that's not the signal of extinction. The signal of impending extinction is the slope at which the populations are declining. When they're declining very quickly, very steeply, that's the signal for extinction. We've got 432 species of North American birds, more than a third of our birds. It's approaching a half of our North American birds with populations that are declining, way too fast, way too fast. We have 1.5 billion fewer breeding birds today in North America than we had just 40 years ago. And this is an example of shifting baseline. Almost everybody in this room is younger than 40 years old, which means you don't remember when we had 1.5 billion more breeding birds around. So when you go outside and it's quiet, it seems normal to you. That's the way it's always been for you. But it's not the way it's always been. None of us here in the room remember the passenger pigeon. Used to be the most numerous bird on the planet, 4 billion of them. Now there are none, and we don't miss them. So if you don't miss these guys, you're not motivated to do something about it. And that's the problem with these slow but steady changes. So let's talk about what we can do about it. What are some of the problems that are causing these disastrous numbers? We do have parks, we have preserves. Part of their mandate is to keep these species around. It's not working. So what's wrong with our parks and preserves? There's a couple of things wrong with them, but the biggest problem is they are too small and they are too isolated from each other. And every year they get smaller and more isolated. And the problem with that is that when you take a large area like this and you shrink it down to a small little habitat patch, and that's an exaggeration, doesn't have to be that small, you're taking large populations and shrinking them down to small populations. And that's the problem. Small populations are highly vulnerable to local extinction. Why? Because all populations fluctuate. In good times they go up, in bad times they go down. If you're a large population, this top line, even in your down cycle, there's enough individuals so you can increase quickly when times get better. But if you're a tiny population like this bottom line here, in those normal fluctuations you often hit zero. You blink out of your little habitat patch and then you're gone. And unless you recolonize it, and this is where the isolation comes in, it's harder and harder to recolonize a patch these days, then you're permanently gone, and that's called local extinction. Local extinction is the key. Don't think of global extinction. If we're talking about box turtles, I don't care if there's still box turtles in the Great Smoky Mountains. I care if they're in the ecosystem that is supporting me, which happens to be in my yard. They are in there, by the way. But we need to look at all the species that are disappearing from where we are right here, because we need functional ecosystems everywhere. Studies all over the planet have are telling us, and some of these are quite old, 100 years in length, that we have not left enough of the natural world around to sustain nature, to sustain that natural world. And unfortunately, that includes our largest national parks. Okay, one thing I've learned in talking to a lot of people is that we all have a limited ability to absorb bad news. I call it your bad news cup. And once it's filled up, you turn off, no more. You might have come here today with your bad news cup filled up. I don't know. But I got to get one more piece of bad news into your bad news cup. And then we'll talk about some good news. And that, of course, is invasive species. Let's just talk about invasive plants. When I say just, there's more than 3,300 species of plants introduced from someplace else that we now consider invasive. Let's define invasive. It's a non-native plant that is aggressively displacing native plant communities. I've heard people say, well, Virginia creeper is invasive. No, it can be aggressive, duking it out with other native plants the way it always has. That's a normal interaction. But an invasive species is from someplace else, and it's here without its natural enemies, without the herbivores or diseases that used to keep it in check. So it has a tremendous competitive advantage over our native plants. Moreover, our overabundance of deer, the deer don't like these non-native plants. So that gives them an even bigger competitive advantage. The deer are eating our native plants and leaving these guys alone. So we got 3,300 species of plants displacing native plant communities. And this is what it looks like when they do that. This is White Clay Creek State Park. I drive by it on the way to work when I go to the University of Delaware, and this is what it looks like in March, when plants from Asia leaf out before plants from North America. And I know it happens here too. You can look at your natural areas, and if they are green early on, look at those plants that are green. They're all from Asia. The native plants have not leafed out yet. So where did these plants come from? They came from our gardens. It's multiflora rose, oriental bittersweet, Japanese honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, miscanthus, barberry, ailanthus, Norway maple, burning bush, ugly Agnes, whatever. A third of the vegetation in most of the natural areas, particularly in the east, are now escapees from our garden that are mostly from Asia. So you might say, well, so who cares about that? Who cares about that is these plants don't support the specialized relationships that I opened the talk with. They are not making the insects that drive our food webs. So it's green. It looks like it's a natural area, but it's not functioning like a natural area. How do I know that? Well, that's what we've been measuring in my lab for about 12 years now. You can actually measure what happens when you take away native plant communities and replace them with non-native plants. And they don't have to be invasive. That's the same thing we do in so many of our human-dominated landscapes. We use ornamental plants from someplace else that are now the base of the food web. What does that do to the food web? And we've published a number of papers on it, and you can go to the literature and you can read it. But I know you're not going to do that. So let's talk about something that you might do, or you can get your younger brothers and sisters to do or something. Remember, this is the age of fake news. I could be a Russian agent. I could be a politician. How would you know that I'm telling you the truth? Don't believe me. Just go out and test this for yourself. I call this my 12 by 12 experiment. That's 12 feet by 12 feet staked out. And you get to determine how much life is going to exist in that space by determining how many plants are there and which plants are there. You can keep it as lawn. You can get on your hands and knees on Wednesday and count all the biodiversity in there. Won't take you long. And then, of course, on Saturday, you mow it and kill it all. Or we could put a tree in there. Let's put a white oak in there. This is a white oak I planted from an acorn 14 years before I took that picture. Fills that 12 by 12 space very nicely. And by the way, that proves two things. It proves oaks grow, that's news to a lot, at least landscapers I know. They will tell their clients, do not plant an oak because you won't live long enough to enjoy it. I'm enjoying it. It doesn't have to be 300 years old before you enjoy your oak. It also proves you can plant an oak that it doesn't have to be 5-inch caliber and cost $15,000. Acorn, free. The interesting thing is, when you plant a small tree, it's much healthier than the big guys because you haven't root pruned it to death. I have a little experiment in my backyard. I've got a red oak, 15-foot tree that I planted, giant root ball, because somebody gave it to me, couldn't sell it. And the same day I planted the acorn of a willow oak, about 20 feet away from it. And the guy said, what are you doing that for? I said, I got it. So, well, now, this is about 16 years later. The red oak is just about dead. It has grown a little bit, but it's just about dead. The willow oak is taller than it, a big, beautiful tree that's, I don't know, it's got to be 30 feet tall at this point. So a little bit of patience and you get a much healthier tree because they've got that giant rootstock. Okay, back to my 12 by 12 experiment. Let's walk around this tree and count the caterpillars that are on those branches. We're not going to get any ladders and fall off. We're just going to stand on the ground and count the caterpillars, and we're going to do it on July 25th of 2014, and we're going to find 410 caterpillars from 19 different species on that tree. And then I'm going to stand back and take that picture so I can ask you, how many caterpillars do you see? How much caterpillar damage do you see? That's what we worry about. But if I knocked on your door and said, you've got 410 caterpillars on your tree, get the spray can, call the man, save the tree. You don't have to save the tree. This is a normal interaction. Oaks have been sharing part of the energy they captured from the sun with caterpillars for a long, long time. They're all still here. They look great. And because my oak is willing to do that, I've got other living things in my yard. I met a woman in New Orleans last year, Tammany Baumgarten, and she suggested that we all practice the 10-step program. Take 10 steps back from your tree and all your insect problems disappear. I think it's good advice. Okay, same day, 12 by 12 experiment. Let's go to a black cherry, same size. Count the caterpillars down here. 239 caterpillars from 14 different species. Now what we're doing is an experiment here. We're comparing how well native plants support life, support these caterpillars, compared to non-native plants. So to find the non-native plants, we have to go to my neighbor's house. There we are, we're at my neighbor's house. Now this is a good comparison because his property is the same size as mine. He moved in the same month that I did. He just had different plant choices. He really liked Callery pear. You might know it as Bradford pear. So he planted 32 of them. So the first thing we have to do is figure out which one we're going to look at. We'll look at this one. Actually, the first thing we have to do is make sure he's not home. 12 by 12, count the caterpillars. And I bet you think I'm going to tell you there were no caterpillars on the Callery pear. Not so. There was one. One little inchworm, one species. Then I went to his burning bush. Both, by the way, Callery pears from Asia, burning bush from Asia, both highly invasive species. I am pulling them out of my yard all the time. 12 by 12 section of burning bush. I got 4 caterpillars from one species, 4 little leaf skeletonizers. Okay, we have just completed our experiment. We have a pattern. But what if we got that pattern by chance? Remember, science is not an opinion, it's a process. We've completed part of the process, but we could have gotten results by chance, so we have to replicate it. You've got to do it over and over again to see whether the pattern you got is real. So we're going to do it again the next day, July 26th. We're going to look at the same species, but different individuals. We're going to get the same pattern. Different numbers, but the same pattern. 233 in the white oak, 53 in the black cherry, 2 in the burning bush, 1 on the Callery pear. And I don't care how many times you do it, that is the pattern you're going to get. Our really productive native plants are supporting most of the life here. And these poor guys from Asia can't do it. It's not because they're evil. It's because they haven't been here long enough to develop the specialized relationships that run the nature in this country. They're running it over in China, not here. How long does it take to develop those specialized relationships? We've only measured it out about 400 years, not even starting. So probably, thousands of years, probably tens of thousands of years to develop that. And in the meantime, all these invasive species are wiping out the native plants with their co-evolved relationships that are supporting our nature. So we can't wait for adaptation to solve this problem. Rick Dark and I gave a talk in Williamsburg, Virginia, 2 springs ago. And after the talk, we drove up, crossed the Bay Bridge, up the eastern shore of Maryland on the way home, and the first building you get to after the Bay Bridge is the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill. And there are all the calorie pears, and that's why people plant them. They've got a nice bloom in the spring, pretty good fall color. I think the real reason is the cheapest tree you can get on the market. And that was the only tree that the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill liked. Okay, we kept driving right past this building, and the very next property was this one. Found out it's owned by a nature conservancy. And look, it is thoroughly invaded with the offspring from these ornamental trees. And this is the horticultural ethical dilemma of our time. A lot of people would argue that the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill has the property rights to plant anything they want on their property. Okay, but do they have the right to biologically pollute all the land around them? To ecologically castrate it with a plant making one caterpillar so that I don't have any chickadees or any other birds? I can drive from New York City to Richmond, Virginia when these guys are in bloom, and it is white all the way down. And this is one species of invasive plant. That's the problem with invasive non-native plants. If these guys were smallpox spores and they happened to be beautiful, we still wouldn't allow the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill to plant them on their property because we recognize that's not good for everybody. Well, we're getting there. We're getting there. Okay. The issue here is that land ownership, according to Roy Dennis in England, he's a land manager there in England, he said land ownership is more than a privilege, it is a responsibility. And this demonstrates that perfectly. It truly is a responsibility. This is planet Earth. And all the life that we know of in the universe, maybe all the complex life, but certainly all the life we're ever going to interact with is right there on the surface of planet Earth. I know we're looking for it out there in space, but that's where it is. It's right there. And we've chopped up, it's called the biosphere. We've chopped up the biosphere into private properties. We say Tom owns this, Dick owns this, Harry owns this, Mary owns this. Okay, private property ownership, but now along with that ownership comes the responsibility of supporting all the life in the universe. I can't think of a more awesome responsibility, and it's not one we have thought about at all. We keep thinking it's endless out there somewhere. It's not. It's all chopped up now. We own it. So now we have to take care of it. How do we do that? Which plants should we put on our properties, put back on our properties, so that we have viable food webs? We've developed a tool. It's called the Native Plant Finder. It's on the National Wildlife Federation website. That allows you to find out the most productive plants in your county. You just put in your zip code and a list of the woody plants and the herbaceous plants that are supporting most of the life in your county will pop up. Native Plant Finder, that's all you need to know. So now we know the most productive plants in every county of the country. And that's great because when we got to look at that, we saw a very striking pattern that jumped out at us. It turns out that there's really just a few plant genera that are producing most of the food. I started calling them foraging hubs. Nobody likes that, so I call them keystone genera. You know, a keystone in the old Roman arches, it's the center stone. If you take it out, the arch falls down. If you take these plants out of your landscape, out of your food web, the food web collapses. And it turns out that just 5% of the local plant genera, native plant genera, are producing between 73 and 75% of the food that's running those food webs. Which means I could build a landscape using 95% of the available plant genera in my area and still have a failed food web. It would only make about 25, 27% of the food if I didn't include these keystone genera. So this is a nuance of what we've talked about for a while now. It's not just native versus non-native. It's the right natives versus plants that are not so productive, because there are a lot of native plants that are not making that much food. And we want to make landscapes with enough food to support other living things. So some of the comparisons here are really striking. Oaks, number one, remember, in the mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species of caterpillars. Compared to what? Well, let's compare it to ginkgo. I've walked past some ginkgo coming in here, stepping on some fruits, by the way. Our lists say that ginkgos support 5 species of caterpillars. We've tracked them down and they're all mistaken host records. We got this data from the literature where somebody wrote down and said, I found a caterpillar on oak and it eats oak, and okay, it's in the literature. Well, somebody said, I found 5 species of caterpillars on ginkgo, but nobody's been able to replicate that. If you ever see something eating a ginkgo, take a picture of it and send it to me, and you will be the first. And I've been saying this for years. So you could say it's 5, it's probably 0, but if you wanted to support wildlife in your neighborhood, would you plant an oak that supports 557 or a ginkgo that supports 5 or 0? Even though it's not invasive, it's not moving around, but it is part of the food web where you are. Number 2 in most counties in the US are native prunus. So black cherry, pin cherry, American plum, Chickasaw plum, 456 species of caterpillars on native prunus. Let's compare that to Zelkova. You guys using Zelkova here? Yes, we use a lot in where I come from. 0 caterpillars on Zelkova. I think we plant that because it looks like the American elms that we lost to Dutch elm disease. And that's what they look like. Nothing eating them, so they always look perfect. And if that is your goal, if your goal is to have a plant that is interacting with nothing in your landscape, Zelkova is for you. But why don't you get a silk Zelkova or a plastic one and stick it out there, and it'll always be perfect, just like the real one, and you won't even have to water it. Pieris japonica used to be the most common foundation plant in North America. This illustrates an important point. We have native Pieris. But our native Pieris are not one of those productive native genera. It only support 2 species of caterpillars. I don't think Pieris japonica supports anything. It could be a native viburnum that supports 103 species of caterpillars. So these are just illustrations of the fact that the plants you choose for your landscapes are doing important things. They're the base of the food web. Think of them as bird feeders. There you go. They're bird feeders. Now you get to decide by your plant choice how well you're going to feed the birds. You could feed them a lot. You could feed them just a little bit. This is what the landscapes around me look like. They are giant lawns, acres of lawns with almost no plants in them at all. But you have to put the plants in your yard that are making bird food, making those caterpillars. In other words, put food in your bird feeders, so there you go. Or you can keep them empty. Here's the ginkgo back there. It's a big tray. But it's not making any food at all. And when we don't think of this keystone principle in landscaping, we're not fooling the birds. I'm going to share a little bit of data from my recent PhD graduate, Desiree Naranjo, who studied breeding chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. She was looking at chickadee breeding success depending on the landscape in which they were breeding, which she could control because she put out the nest boxes. And chickadees are tree hole nesters. Tree holes are always in short supply. They'll nest almost any place you put out a tree hole. Well, right there's where the nest was. This is the foraging territory of one pair of chickadees. And this is, again, inside the Beltway in D.C. So 95% of the foraging took place within that red line, and 95% of the foraging took place on those trees that are blue right there. So let's see what they are. Well, they're all the native trees in this landscape. Basswood, sweet gum, American elm, black cherry, 2 species of oaks. Let's also look at the trees that they did not forage on. And those are all the trees from Asia. Japanese maples, silk tree, there's our friend the ginkgo, black poplar, crepe myrtle, saucer magnolia. And it's very easy to find a landscape where those are the dominant plants. And when that happens, we get to compare what happens to the chickadees in the landscape dominated by these introduced plants with a landscape that is dominated by native plants. Well, the landscapes dominated by introduced plants have 75% fewer caterpillars. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So the parents would come, they'd see the nest box, they'd say, we want to breed here, but there's not enough food. Some of them did decide to breed there, even when there wasn't enough food. And we think they were first-year birds. They hadn't had experience, and they were just stupid. And they made 1.5 fewer eggs. Their nests were 29% less likely to survive, 1.2 fewer fledglings, and they delayed maturation by 1.5 days. And the chicks that did fledge were lighter than the chicks from native landscapes. And a light chick has less of a chance of making it later on. And you might say, those are not huge differences. But when you put all of that together into a population growth model, you get this. So if you look at population growth as a function of the percentage of non-native plants in the landscape, you see that as you increase the number of non-native plants in the landscape, the population growth falls below replacement rate. This dotted line here is the number of baby chicks that have to be produced every year to replace the adults that are lost every year. And if you don't make enough chicks so that you're down in this area, that's an unsustainable population. The only place that the error bars of this line go above replacement rate is when you have about 30% or less non-native plants, fewer non-native plants in your landscape. If you have more than 30% non-native plants, then you're diving down below replacement rate. And if you're wondering why we have 432 species of North American birds in steep decline, starving them, not providing enough food for replacement rate reproduction has got to be one of the reasons. And this is the first time this has been measured for any bird anywhere in relation to the landscape plants. So the point is, first of all, this is chickadees. They want to breed with people. It's a really important reminder that the plants we choose are determining how much life is out there in our yard. So we should all take note. She also looked at the number of migrants that stopped and spent the day in her residential neighborhoods. 51 species of migrants stopped inside the Beltway in DC. Our migrants don't fly around our cities. And they don't fly during the day. They fly at night, they fly all night long, and then they come down during the day, people say to rest. Yeah, they're resting, but they also have to gas up. They've got to eat. They've got to eat. And if they come down in the land of ginkgo, there's nothing to eat. And that's the end of their migration. If you've ever seen a little bird shivering on the ground, it's a migrant who hasn't found enough food, and unless he gets food real fast, that's the end. So it's another reason that our birds are disappearing. You know, a lot of people say, I don't have a property big enough to support breeding birds, and that may be true. But if you have a property big enough to support one tree, and you make it the right tree, you can support migrating birds. And they desperately need your support. So you don't have to save biodiversity for a living. Some of you will end up doing that, but most of you won't. But please consider saving biodiversity where you live. Or if you get into the horticultural business, you're going to influence a lot of landscapes. Consider saving it there as well. Because our privately owned lands are the future of conservation. We have moved plants all over the country, all over the world, plants and animals, creating what Richard Hobbs here calls novel ecosystems. And by that he simply means that the organisms, and he says 75% of the ecosystems on Earth are considered novel because they're just meeting each other for the first time in evolutionary history. And some ecologists are excited about this. Oh, we get to watch evolution and everything else. Well, in the meantime, all of the specialized relationships, the co-evolved relationships that have been around for eons are leaving these novel ecosystems. If you're waiting for monarchs to adopt to their new novel ecosystem of corn and soybeans, they're going to disappear long before that happens. So we have a steady drain of species from novel ecosystems, and if novel ecosystems are losing species, we might want to ask, how many species do we need? How many species do we humans need? Let's be selfish about it. We're good at that. I'm going to argue we need all of them. We need all of them because it is the plants and animals in our ecosystems that are running those ecosystems, that are creating what we call ecosystem services, the life support systems that keep, or services that keep humans around on this planet. We should call them biodiversity services instead of ecosystem services, and maybe people would appreciate why we need life a little bit more than they do right now. There was a huge study, came out in 2005, Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, 170 scientists from around the world studying the Earth's ability to support us, to make those ecosystem services. And their unhappy conclusion way back in 2005 is that we have already degraded planet Earth's ability to support us by 60%. That's the ocean, by the way, that is not a recycling plant. That's the same as taking planet Earth and shrinking it by 60%. At the same time, we keep increasing our populations, increasing our economies. We can grow our population, we can grow our economy at the same rate that the planet is growing. I hope there's no economists in this room, because they don't want to hear that. The Earth is finite. We have to appreciate that. We've turned it into Gone with the Wind here, because we like this aesthetic. I don't know how many species used to be in this space, but they are now gone with the wind for sure. So what we need to do is blow up the Earth again. We need to put the plants back where we took them away, increase the Earth's ability to support us, increase its carrying capacity. And we really can do that. Where are we going to do it? We're going to do it on private land. 85.6% of the U.S. east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 83% of the entire U.S. is privately owned. So we do have parks and preserves, and they are vital in terms of that's the refuge for nature right now, but they're not big enough. They're not doing the job. It's going to happen on private property, on the property that you either own now or will own. And that makes you important players. If you own a part of the biosphere, you got to take care of it. And that means we've got to raise the bar about what we've been asking our little piece of the biosphere to do. In the past, we've asked it to be pretty. And we're good at that. We're good at making it pretty. But now we also have to ask it to support life. We have to have those viable food webs there, or we're going to lose that life, and we can't afford to do that. They have to sequester carbon, because you all know we have way too much carbon in the atmosphere. I had a student a couple of years ago that says, we need to invent a machine that pulls carbon out of the atmosphere and locks it up and then pumps it into the soil. I said, that's good, but we already have trees which do exactly that. But of course, we've taken away more than half of the trees of the planet. And where's all that carbon? Up in the atmosphere right now. So we have to put the plants back that are sequestering carbon. We have to manage our watersheds. Everybody lives in a watershed. Nobody has the ethical right to destroy it. I don't think anybody's purposely trying to do that, but we haven't thought about it. We have to enrich our soil. We're going to enrich it with carbon. The soil scientists now tell us that our soils can store 7 times the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere right now. The only issue is getting it there. Again, plants do that every day. And we have to support our pollinators. Supporting pollinators is now politically correct, or it was 2 years ago. Why do we have to support pollinators? You're going to tell me because they pollinate our crops, a third of our crops. May Berenbaum, you know Mayor Berenbaum. She's the head chair of the department in entomology in Illinois. She just re-looked at that. Nobody can figure out where that third of our crops came from. And her best estimate is pollinators actually pollinate about 12% of our crops when we eat healthily. But when we actually eat the way we do, it's about 7% of our crops. Forget our crops. Forget our crops. That's not why we need pollinators. We need pollinators because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we would lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. Not an option. It is simply not an option. We are not talking about good land stewardship here, recommended land stewardship. We're talking about essential land stewardship. And what do we worry about? How tight is Serena Williams' outfit when she's playing tennis? I don't make this up. That's what we worry about. I read about this. This is a yard down the street from me. These are all calorie pears here, but they're actually gone. They all fell down last winter, so now there are no trees in this yard. It is a beautiful lawn, but there's no food web there. Very little carbon sequestration. In terms of plant carbon sequestration, lawn is your worst option. It's actively destroying my watershed, and there are no pollinators there. I do think we're going to reach the point in the not too distant future where this type of treatment of the biosphere is simply not going to be permitted. We can't afford it. There are too many of us on the planet to waste it like this. We've measured the amount of lawn in southeast Pennsylvania, northeast Delaware, or northeast Maryland and Delaware in residential neighborhoods. 92% of the area that could be landscape is lawn. 92% looks like that. There are only 10% of the tree biomass that could be there, and it's usually these short-lived ornamental trees from Asia that fall over in 30 years and release all the carbon they just sequestered. We got to get the big guys back that are pumping carbon in the soil all the time. And here's my neighbor's house with his 32 calorie pears. He owns 10 acres, and every plant he has put on that 10 acres, every plant is a non-native plant. Why has he done that? Well, he doesn't know, native or non-native. He simply goes to the nursery, and he buys what everybody else is planting. He's looking for something pretty. We have fallen into the trap into thinking that plants are only decorations, because they are great decorations. They're beautiful. We love beauty. So we buy things that are pretty. They can be screen anchors, focal points, but it's all been about aesthetics with no thought to the ecological role that our plants have to start playing in human-dominated ecosystems. And when we landscape like that, thinking plants are just decorations, landscaping becomes ecological destruction. But we could also find pretty plants that support food webs, protect watersheds, store carbon, restore the soil, do all the things we need them to do. And when we select our plants with function in mind as well as beauty, then landscaping equals ecological restoration. And we have to keep working at this until those two words are totally synonymous at this point, at the future point, whenever they are. All right, how do we do that? What's a biodiversity-friendly neighborhood look like? These are three things we have to do. We have to put enough plants back in between those isolated habitat fragments so that they're not isolated anymore. If they're not isolated anymore, who's in between those fragments? We are. That's where we live, where we work, where we play, where we farm. Put the plants back. Then those isolated habitat fragments are connected. If they're connected, the populations within them aren't tiny. And if they're not tiny, when they fluctuate, they won't disappear anymore. Building these biological corridors is the best thing we can do to stop the steady drain of species from our human-dominated landscapes. Where are we going to put those plants? I suggest we put them in the area that's in lawn. We now have lawn area, 45.6 million acres, an area the size of New England is in lawn, and we're still adding 500 square miles of lawn every year. And we're doing that because lawn is a status symbol. It's part of our culture. But I learned we can change our status symbols. I went to Montana a couple of years ago. I looked around, they did not have big lawns. And I asked my host, where's your big lawns? He said, well, we only get 9 inches of rain a year. He said, but that's not our status symbol. I said, it's not? He said, no. And I said, well, what is your status symbol? He thought about it and he said, big belt buckles. So I'm excited about that. I think that's the answer. If we double the size of our belt buckles and cut the size of our lawn in half, we've got it. And then, of course, we want to use those powerhouse plants to build these corridors. So what we're talking about here is this is what we used to do. We build our house, put in our foundation, planting a few trees here and there. Then we were exhausted, no more landscaping. So everything by default became lawn. Let's turn that on its head. Let's build the house and now figure out where we do want lawn. Lawn is the perfect plant. Turf grass is the perfect plant to walk on without killing it. So you're going to put the lawn where we walk. I look at where my neighbors walk on their 10 acres. Nowhere. They're never outside. But what if you want to get married in the front yard? You need lawn there. If you want to walk to the backyard, you need a path. Throw the frisbee, have a barbecue. Wherever you're going to use your yard, that's where the lawn goes. And then everything by default becomes heavily planted. And this is the landscape design challenge of our times. How do we get all these plants into our landscapes without it being wild and messy? We get it. People don't like wild and messy. But they do like arboretums that have a lot of plants. So we can do this. And if we convince our neighbors to do the same thing, then we've got the connectivity that connects with the woodlot over here and the woodlot over here, or depending on where you live, biome appropriate, the prairie over here and the prairie over here. Look, we still have lawn. We still get to play with our lawnmowers, so it'll be all right. But not only will you stop the steady drain of species if you do this, you'll reverse it. They will come. And I could tell you that by what we've done on our 10 acres at home. Mowed for hay when we moved in. We now have 55 species of breeding birds on that property. And it happened really quickly. You just put the plants back and all that life comes. Now, if we do this in half the area that's in lawn, let's make the math simple. Let's say we've got 40 million acres in lawn. We cut that in half. We can build a new national park that will be 20 million acres in size. We're going to do it at home, so we'll call it Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, the Grand Canyon, Denali, which is huge, the Great Smoky Mountains. You add up all those parks, it's still less than 20 million acres. So let's do that. Let's take areas that look like this. This is the entrance to the Toledo Zoo. Got a very nice grass median here filled with dandelions. Let's turn it into that. When the zoo people did this, they didn't consult the board. And the board had a fit. They said, nobody's going to come to the zoo anymore. Changing culture is hard. It's very hard. Whoops. Let's take these square things and turn it into this. This is actually a high-end landscape on Fisher's Island off the coast of Long Island. It's where the rich folks live. The Roosevelts live here. I should have included more of the house. But this landscape is doing everything I said that we should be doing in an eastern deciduous forest. It's sequestering lots of carbon, managing the watershed, lots of food webs there. The only thing it's not doing is supporting pollinators. So let's put in a pollinator garden as well. Then we've got it covered. So here's the agricultural ethic now, that we take away all the weeds. We take away the goldenrod and the asters that support the monarch migration as it moves south. We take away the food for the 4,000 species of native bees that are all in decline, so that we can have lawn. But it could be this. It could be this. Both those pictures are taken in Iowa. And Iowa's actually leading the way now in roadside transformations like that. They have done, I don't know what it is. It's a couple thousand miles worth of roadside transformation. So this is a mulch sculpture that proves you cannot use native plants in a formal setting, except nobody told the folks in Indianapolis, you know this planting here? That's an all-native planting that's the first year of the planting, too, by the way, in a formal setting. Formality is not a function of the plants in the design. It's a function of the design itself. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And I guess it's okay because they're non-natives over there. This is a corporate landscape, invites the employees to come out at noon to get sunburn. Could be a lovely setting like this. And there's I'm sure you already know this. There's great research showing that just 15 minutes in a landscape like this produces measurable medical benefits. Your stress hormone, your cortisol goes down, your blood pressure goes down. It boosts your immune system. Your attention span is restored. Your cancer is cured. You don't get divorced anymore. But I'm not kidding about that. When you spend time in nature, it really does boost your immune system. It gives you the same medical benefits that you get from intense meditation, and it's being studied more and more. They always get the same answer. But you can't go to Yellowstone for 2 weeks in the summer and expect to get those benefits the rest of the year. You have to be exposed to this every day, and the only way to do that is to live in an area like that or work in an area like that. So I'm going to put another ball up there, call it mental health, or I could call it physical health. Let's just call it human health. If I put a tree outside of a hospital room, the patient gets better faster. If I put a tree outside of a classroom, test scores go up. The common feature here seems to be stress. When you interact with nature, even in a minimal way, your stress level drops, and when your stress level drops, you do everything better. So it's a very powerful effect. Does that mean your yard has to be 100% native to get these benefits? No, it doesn't. I finally figured out how to word this. It's not the presence of introduced plants that destroys ecosystems, unless they're invasive. It's the absence of native plants. And really, that's the problem with invasives. They take the native plants away. So this gives us the option here of cleverly mixing and matching. As long as we have enough natives to run that ecosystem, we can have our favorite non-natives in there. But the natives have to be present. Let's use crepe myrtle as an example. It's a perfect example of a decoration. You can get it in any color. It's not too tall. It's got exfoliating bark. And of course, as you move further and further south, it becomes more and more common. I was just in South Carolina. That's now the only plant in South Carolina. What do its leaves contribute to food webs? Nothing. So, what's pretty but not biologically active? I always think of a statue, but how many statues do you want? One or two. One or two will do it, but you can easily overdo it. How do you know when you've succeeded? Countless ways to know when you've succeeded, but this has to be one of them. When you have holes in your leaves. This is holistic gardening. This is a shingle oak in my yard, and it's passed on part of its energy to a caterpillar, which is now in the belly of a bird. If you go home and you look at the leaves in the plantings in your yard, and there are no holes in them, it means none of the energy was transferred up food webs. That's a dead-end food web. That means you have no other life forms there. So this is not a reason to grab the spray can. It's a reason to celebrate. We have life because there are holes. But this is the real measure here. If you have breeding birds in your yard, because you cannot have breeding birds in your yard unless there's enough food nearby. We can save nature, but only if we learn to live with it. And I'm finally going to leave you with an example of how easy that this actually can be. This is the Atala butterfly. The residential neighborhoods in South Florida accidentally saved this species from extinction. How did that happen? Well, it's a small little lycaenid butterfly that's beautiful as an adult, it's beautiful as a larva, it's even beautiful as a chrysalis, but like the other things I talked about, it's a host plant specialist, but an extreme specialist that only eats one species of plant, the coontie, native cycad in South Florida. Well, coontie has an interesting history. It had a lot of starch in its roots. The Seminole Native Americans knew that. They used it as a source of starch. Around 1900, well, they taught the settlers in Florida. Right? There's a lot of starch in coontie roots. Then around 1900, somebody had the bright idea of making a starch industry out of coontie roots. So about that time, the starch in our collars came from coontie roots. Somebody did a survey in Miami in 1908. 80% of the people answered the survey, said they were starch gatherers. And they did. They gathered all the starch. They eliminated coontie from the wild, extirpated from the wild. There were a few plants left in gardens, but of course, if you take away the only host plant for this butterfly, the butterfly is going to disappear. 1973, we got the Endangered Species Act. There was a desperate attempt to try to find some Atalas in Florida so they could get it listed as an endangered species, so they could get some federal funding to try to save it. So they looked all over Florida and they couldn't find any. So instead, they got it listed officially as extinct. But about that time, somebody in the horticulture trade recognized coontie as a viable landscape plant in Florida. It does well in the sandy soils of South Florida. It's an evergreen shrub. Perfect. And they started to promote it. So now big plantings of coontie like this are commonplace in and around Miami. And look who showed up again. And I used to say nobody knows where it came from, but now somebody's claiming, oh, there was a remnant population on one of the keys, and it's now out colonizing these plantings. And in many places where it's doing quite well. And that's what I love about this story. It truly was an accident. They never got the Atala listed as an endangered species. They never got one dime of conservation funding. All they did was change the palette of plants used commonly in residential landscaping, and the butterfly saved itself, which shows this is a really powerful form of conservation. If we can save this beautiful butterfly from extinction by accident, think what we could do if we made conservation a conscious goal of landscaping. And I think it's going to work because nature has impressed me by being a lot more malleable, a lot more resilient, a lot more forgiving than I ever thought she would be. And I do think she will give us one more chance. Thank you very much.
So we're going to take some questions now, and there's a button in front of you on the desk. You'll need to hold that down while you ask your question. So anyone raise your hand if you have a question.
Everybody's getting hungry. Yes?
About the non-invasive plants, what would happen if you introduced caterpillars from other regions that feed on those plants? Would you get birds then?
Right. What would happen if we brought caterpillars over to eat the invasive plants? In some cases we have done that. This is it's called biocontrol. You're introducing an insect that will eat the non-native plant. But it's very difficult to do that because first you have to demonstrate that insect is a super specialist like the Atala and the coontie, that it won't eat any other plant in the genus, any other plant in North America. In other words, there'll be no host shift. That takes about 10 years worth of testing, and if you can't demonstrate that, you don't get permission to bring it in. And then that would be one species. Remember, where these plants come from, there are dozens, probably hundreds of species eating them. So to actually get control of the plant, sometimes it works, but it's difficult. Yes?
So I know a lot of homeowners, like their big argument is they want a landscape that's low maintenance. And I know that like maintaining a native landscape could be, they might argue that it would be more intensive in terms of maintenance because you have more plants to take care of. And so I'm just curious, like what your how would you respond to that?
Okay, how do we deal with the maintenance issue? First of all, once it's all planted, and if it's done properly, where you're planting it dense enough so you don't have a lot of weeding opportunities, it's not as much maintenance as a lot of people envision. But I do get it that it's easy riding back and forth on a mower, although you do have to do that every week. Most people don't do that. They hire a lawn, business, thank you, to take care of their yard. So they could do the same thing. They could hire a native plant maintenance business to take care of them, come once a month and weed out the invasives and do whatever needs to be done. It's a big open niche out there for people looking for a future. Because we have to garden the world now, and none of it is maintenance free. So that's an employment opportunity. It's another one of those responsibilities. If you're going to own part of the biosphere, you got to be willing to pay to take care of it. So I'll agree with you. There is some maintenance involved, but there are a lot of people here who could take care of that. Anything else? Yes.
You mentioned oak and cherry
Yes.
as two of the
Top
keystones.
Top
Yeah.
two. Willows, number 3.
Do you have a list somewhere published?
It's on that website, Native Plant Finder.
Okay.
And it'll be a list tailored for your county.
Excellent. Okay.
That's
Thank you.
the beauty of that list. Okay. Yes.
Thank you very much. You talked a little bit about, sort of the different angles that you can approach this, and that some of it comes from industry, some of it comes from landscapers, people's choices. But, one thing that I hear a lot about is what's available. And at box stores is where a lot of people go to get their plants, and that's often where you cannot find native plants. So I'm just curious if you have more experience or could comment on places where you see that shifting, or where the availability or adoption of native plants is easier for people to get.
Yeah, I come from, I live in southeast Pennsylvania, near Longwood Gardens and all the DuPont estates and everything. Actually, Mount Cuba, if you've ever been there, it's a 100% native plant DuPont estate. The native industry is doing quite well there. There are a lot of nurseries that are 100% native, and most nurseries carry a lot of them. So I'm in an area where the percentage of native plants has increased dramatically. Why? It's responding to the market, and that will happen anywhere. If people went to the box store and only bought natives, they would stock more of them. I guarantee it. They're businessmen. All nurserymen want to do is sell a plant. It's not that they have some secret covenant with Asian plants. They just want to sell a plant. They don't believe that you're going to buy all natives. They're not thinking about the function yet, but but that is changing. And I've been talking about this for more than 10 years, and I do see a big change. So it depends on where you are in the country. It changes at various rates, but the percentage of natives is increasing. In St. Louis, there's a native plant grower, Mervyn Wallace, and he's been doing this since the 80s. And I asked him not too long ago, how are sales? And he actually had a printout for me. Straight, he can't keep up with it. He's hiring new people. It's going off the charts. So, and that's true in a lot of places. People are really enthusiastic about this. Sometimes you have to look beyond the box stores. They're not going to be the leaders. Yes.
Oh, okay. So some of the box stores are starting to sell native hybrids. So what do you think of these so-called nativars, and how does that affect?
Okay, by hybrid you probably mean cultivar, which is a genetic variant of a straight species. And there are good reasons why we have cultivars. Some good reasons why we have cultivars. Introducing disease resistance when it's necessary. In a lot of places we wouldn't have any American elms if we didn't have disease resistance. Some of the powdery mildew resistant varieties are important. We actually did a study looking at the impact of 6 common traits that are found in woody plants, looking at the impact on insects that eat woody plant leaves. So we were not looking at flowers. That's a bigger study. It's more complicated. And how would they impact pollinators? We were looking at the herbivores on woody plants. And we found that the only trait that made any difference in insect use was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple, which makes sense because to make it red or purple, you're introducing anthocyanins, which are feeding deterrents. So if you get that red leaf, red bud, you've taken a plant that would normally support a lot of things and making it support almost nothing with that one cultivar change. But the other 5 traits we looked at, taking a tall plant, making it short, enhancing fruit size. We did look at disease resistance. None of those had any impact. So the answer to your question is, it depends on the genetic trait that was changed. There are 2 things that I caution about with cultivars, and that is, when that's the only thing that's sold, it perpetuates the idea that plants are just decorations, and you got to have a new one every year. You're not gonna buy it. And also, to propagate them, most of the time it's done clonally. So you're putting a plant with 0 genetic variability out in the landscape. And particularly in the age of climate change, when our climate is getting more and more variability, we know 0 genetic variability is not a great idea. So what I would love to see the nursery industry do is sell the straight species right alongside of the cultivars, and then at least give people the option if they want to buy it. And again, if a lot of people get serious about this, the market will drive it. More and more people will sell straight species and say, okay, cultivars aren't doing as well anymore. We'll see. But I'd love to have people have the option. You had a question too.
Have you had any frank conversations with your neighbors about their lawns?
I had one. We have first of all, we have a long flag lot driveway, and he can't see us at all. So there's no, I'm not infringing on his aesthetic values or anything. But one day he did come walking down the driveway, and I do have a little lawn in front there, and then I've got a rock wall, then I've got a goldenrod field beyond that. He came down, he stared, and he looked at that, and he said, "Why don't you mow that?" Because to him, that's good land stewardship. I'm white trash. I don't know what I am, but I'm not taking care of my property, because you mow it if you're going to take care of it. And I said, his name is Sam. He's my good neighbor, Sam. I said, "Sam, there's a lot of things that live there, and I like that." He goes, and he walked back up the property, and that's the talk we had. We're from different worlds. He's got a sign in his yard, "Evolution is a lie." There's a long way to go with Sam, and it is more important to me that I get along with my neighbor. It's very difficult to have your neighbor come to you and tell you you're living wrong. You got to live like he does. That's not going to wash. So the only thing I can do is provide an example. It's not working real well, but the best thing we can do if we want to convert the culture is to create some dynamite-looking native plant landscapes that don't interfere with our aesthetic values, but are really, really productive. And there's a lot of people working on that. That's working in some areas. But that also puts constraints on us. You need to get farther west. You get into the prairie region. A lot of people want to put a prairie right in the front yard. I appreciate that, but that then in this wintertime, it's all dead stalks. It's a hard sell in today's culture. So maybe you can start out in the backyard with the prairie. I don't know.
Got time for maybe one more.
One more question. Yes.
So my question is more or less about vegetable gardens and the kind of biodiversity that you can find in something like that. And I'm a college student. I like to eat. So if I plant a vegetable garden, I want to eat. And what kind of insects have you done research in that department would kind of make that a better habitat?
Well, I'm an old guy, and I like to eat too. So really, you're talking about apples and oranges here. I am not suggesting that we stop growing food, because I get that we do need food. Half of planet Earth is dedicated towards agriculture now. Half of the terrestrial parts. So we're taking a lot of land for agriculture, and there are things we can do to make that land more productive. We've gotten rid of our hedgerows, and the ones that are there are all invasives, and so we can improve a lot of things. But I am not suggesting that you can't have your vegetable garden in your yard. Your tomatoes, that's a bad example because they're actually from this hemisphere anyway. But most of the things we eat came with us from the old world, and they're not readily part of the food web supporting local biodiversity. So growing food close at home, that's reduces the ecological footprint of agriculture. So I'm all for that. I'm just talking about the rest of the area where you're not growing food. Thanks very much.